What's up, YouTube? Capital G here, doing another episode of decks to strongly consider picking up. And this is a video series where I like to talk about lower tier decks that have kind of been forgotten in the meta. And I explain some reasons why you might want to consider picking these archetypes up again. Sometimes it's because they're getting more support, and I think that they have more potential because of the new support, or I think their competitive viability is definitely going to be increased. Or sometimes I just believe that they are naturally a counter to a lot of the meta or the expected meta, and this is the case when it comes to Evilswarm, or at this point we don't even need to call it Evilswarm, we can just call it Ophion.deck, which, I mean, Ophion is the entire reason that you would even consider playing Evilswarm and a future meta. And honestly, that isn't anything new. If you go all the way back to the origins of Evilswarm and its release during the Zeal era, I mean, it pretty much has always been a boss monster or bust deck. It's always been a deck that largely revolves around Ophion because Ophion is just a super strong card, and it pretty much is immune to power creep. Even when it was released, you know, during the Dragon Ruler era or whatever, it was a card that did actually counter Dragon Rulers because, you know, they couldn't summon any monsters, or at least they couldn't summon the monsters they wanted to. They couldn't summon the Dragon Rulers, and unless they had a couple of outs like Skill Drain could get it off the board, you know, maybe they could use a blaster, they just couldn't do anything. You guys know that Ophion basically just sits on the field and says, no, you will not special summon high level monsters, and the Dragon Rulers was an entire deck of high level monsters. Evilswarm is very similar to a deck like Six Samurai, where you really need that boss monster to control the game, limit your opponent's options. Ever since like post Storm of Ragnarok, Six Samurais have kind of played that way, and Evilswarm have pretty much played that way ever since their existence. Now, Evilswarm have completely fallen off, and a lot of that has to do with, you know, like Burning Abyss being such a strong deck in the meta, the fact that Necroz isn't necessarily a good matchup against or for Evilswarm, even though you would kind of think that it is, because Evilswarm can kind of lock out Trishula and Valkyris. There are things like Colossalus and Unicorn that just completely countered this card, plus the, you know, they had the Genlock and all that other stuff. But if you look at the meta that we're about to go into, you know, I think that Ophion's going to be pretty good. Now, the death of Evilswarm has always been Exceed decks. That's Sotelo Knights was another deck that just kind of made it like very impossible for Evilswarm to be relevant. Actually, the entire Duelist Alliance era was just not very good for Evilswarm. You know, Cleavefort should have been a deck that Evilswarm countered because they wouldn't be able to pendulum summon, but they could just normal summon, they could stall with Sacrifice, they use Skill Drain, which would turn this guy off. The only deck that Evilswarm really countered from Duelist Alliance was, you know, pretty much like Yang Zing, which wasn't super popular, and Shadows. Decks like Sotelo Knights and Burning Abyss were nightmare matchups. In general, the counter to Evilswarm is Exceeds, but if you look at where the format might be heading, I think we're going to be moving to a format where Exceeds are not going to be nearly as potent as they are right now. I mean, we know that you've got Phantom Knights and Burning Abyss and those kind of, you know, combining into one deck, PK Fire, which obviously, I'll be very blunt about it, that deck would absolutely destroy Evilswarm. It would outgrind it, and, you know, Evilswarm would get practically no value because there'd be nothing that you'd actually stop. But if you really look at the OCG and a lot of the decks that are very played over there, Ophion turn 1 can just completely shut them down. You can get free wins. Take a deck like ABCs. This is probably arguably the best deck in Japan. It just won their nationals. Drop an Ophion on them. Obviously, they can't go into ABC Dragon. They can't go into the Cyber Dragon Affinities. They have dead cards galore like Galaxy Soldier, can't even summon it. I mean, the only thing that they can really do at that point is try and desperately go into like a bunch of rank 4 Exceeds, but, you know, that's when things like Solemn and Bottomless just come in, and it makes their deck very, it makes them very predictable, it makes them very linear, and it only gives them kind of one out to a card that just literally can tear them apart. You look at the Metaphors, and yes, they still can pendulum summon some of the lower level Metaphors monsters, but they can't go into their big monsters. They can't really establish anything. They're just sitting there essentially waiting to die as Ophion just rams. I mean, at that point, you can just summon any other decent sized beaters like Heliotrope or Kirkion, maybe even a Thunderbird if you're going to run that, and you can just kind of run them over. DDDs, although we don't have Pendulum Domination, DDDs are a super strong deck in the OCG, probably a top 3 deck, and this is a deck that would just get completely slaughtered and gutted. I'm talking to the point where they literally would have no plays. DDDs is a deck that likes the fusion just as much as it likes the synchro, and obviously Ophion takes both of those options away. Not to mention, the deck does just like that. It likes to special summon high-level monsters just inherently, or by way of things like green slime and whatnot. So this is a deck that would get eviscerated. We know that metaphors like to mix in a lot of Yang Zings. I expect this deck to be super popular because of the new cards coming out of Invasion Vengeance. And yes, Yang Zings would be able to, you know, like float a lot, but they wouldn't be able to synchro, which means they're really not doing anything. At that point, you know, all you need to do is just throw down maybe an Abyss Dweller alongside of your Ophion, and, you know, you pretty much just have GG at that point. The Yang Zing player, I guess, is just desperately searching for maybe something like Skill Drain to out your Ophion. Blue Eyes and Blue Eyes variants with like Chaos Max, I mean, it's pretty obvious they're just going to get destroyed by Ophion. And even when you look at just the TCG, which again, I am basing some of this off of decks like Monarchs potentially getting hits, and, you know, maybe Dante going to 1 so that PK Fire wouldn't necessarily be so much of like the meta. But even if you look at a deck like Cosmos, if you get a turn 1 Ophion on them, won't they struggle against that? I mean, I'm not even sure that Cosmos even run Good Witch in the main deck anymore. I mean, obviously they wouldn't be able to summon any of their spaceships. At that point, they're just kind of sitting there waiting for, you know, they're desperately hoping that they get like a Cosmojo. But in the meantime, you can just Ophion swing, Ophion swing, Ophion swing. You can't get a Slip Rider on board. You can't summon a Dart Destroyer. You know what I mean? I'm putting a whole bunch of offensive pressure on you, and you can draw all the Solemns that you want. If I've got the Ophion on board, I'm just beating you down. And another reason that I love Ophion as opposed to some of the other great lockout monsters like Cyber Dragon Infinity or Rafflesia, you know, Abyss Dweller decks, or cards that can kind of lock your opponent out of being able to do a lot of what they want to do, is that kaijus do not out Ophion. So, you know, you have some people who like to mix in kaijus in the main deck. I've seen it in Mermail and Burning Abyss, etc., etc. Well, you can't actually tribute Ophion for a kaiju. It's kind of like trying to tribute a Fossil Diner for a kaiju, or trying to synchro with a Fossil Diner. Just like in the old Duelist Alliance era, you couldn't use Super Polymerization on an Ophion to summon, like, you know, like a Winder or something like that. You can't actually tribute an Ophion for a kaiju. So that's one of just the big ways that people like to out, you know, these super stun monsters. Just can't do it, you know. So I'm looking at Ophion and I'm like, man, as long as we can kind of dodge Monarchs at like a regional or something like that, if you're playing against these decks, you obviously have a huge advantage. And yes, going second might be a little bit of an issue, but, you know, that's when things like Regeki and Dark Hole can definitely come in. And I've also considered other things like Neospatian Grand Maul, though. If you summon this turn 1, then you're probably not going to drop Ophion in the same turn. But I do think that this is quite a good card as well. So I'm just looking at Evilswarm and I'm like, damn, Ophion, you counter so much of the meta, because as long as there aren't that many dominant Exceed decks in the game, I think that Ophion can shine if these are going to be the decks that are, you know, going to be at the top tables, if these are going to be the decks that are meta. And another card that I kind of like, I'm kind of liking the thought of Exceed Reborn, because it ideally should take a ton for your opponent to out your first Ophion. But hypothetically, if they do, I mean, just being able to flip over Exceed Reborn and bam, just dropping Ophion on them. Because in this like upcoming formats, I would probably run like, you know, with the projected meta, I just got to throw that in there, I would probably consider running like triple Ophion, because I think that, again, he is largely the win condition. And Infestation Pandemic is a card that I kind of cut down to 1. I'd probably go back to like 2, just because if you do happen to run into things like Monarchs, as long as you can kind of wall up, I think you'll be fine. But you don't want to lose out to a thing like Stormforth, and this basically counters their Stormforth. And at that point, you can kind of just sit back with your Solemns or your defensive cards, and I actually think that you might even be able to handle Monarchs, because they won't really be able to use Aether's effect at all. So that's a bonus. And at that point, all they can really do is, you know, use Karaz or things like, you know, Erebus, or try to attack with Aether. But that's just a couple of cards, so I think that you can actually, you know, maybe potentially dodge around that. So let me know what you guys think. I know Yugi No did a video about this about I think it was a little over a month ago. Shout outs to him, he definitely saw this coming. But I think I think he didn't talk so much about like the OCG. And I'm looking at some of the tournament results from like YGO organization. I'm seeing like ABC, DDD, you know, Metaphos, Blue Eyes, and I'm just like, man, if you could just summon an Ophion, you could just lock those decks completely out of playing, or you'd make them so linear where they're just like sitting there desperately like, man, if I don't get cast, I'm gonna lose to this Ophion. And then you drop a second Ophion on them, and it's just pretty much GG. So let me know what you guys think. Thank you for watching as always. I'm gonna throw a Rescue Rabbit in here before I end. Thank you guys for watching as always.